The mysterious music. The park was just an ordinary park on an ordinary afternoon. The air was warm, but not too warm. The kind of weather that made people want to sit outside a little longer. Children chased each other across the grass, there. Shoes kicking up little clouds of dust. Joggers passed by, earbuds in, lost in their own playlists. A few office workers sat on benches with coffee cups, staring at their phones. Life moved in its usual way. Until the music began. It started so softly that no one noticed at first. A few gentle piano notes floated through the air, almost like the breeze had decided to hum a tune. But as the sound grew clearer, people's heads began to lift. Some thought it might be coming from a speaker somewhere. But then they saw her. She was sitting at the old public piano, the one that had been placed in the park years ago and forgotten by most. The wood was chipped, the paint was faded, and a few keys were stuck, but in her hands it sounded alive. She sat straight but relaxed, her eyes closed as if she wasn't in the park at all. Her fingers moved with a quiet certainty. Not fast, not show, it just... Sure, like the music had been waiting for her to find it. She didn't look like someone performing. She didn't seem to care if anyone was listening. It was as if she had built a small, invisible room around herself, a place where only she and the music existed, and yet the sound seeped out, touching everyone around without asking permission. A man walking his dog slowed his steps. The dog sniffed the grass, but the man's eyes stayed on the girl at the piano, an elderly man leaning. Anna Kane found himself drifting closer. He told himself he was just curious, but he knew that wasn't the truth. The truth was, the sound felt like something he'd been missing, even if he couldn't name it. A group of teenagers, normally loud and restless, paused mid-conversation. They exchanged glances, then quietly stepped toward the music. Something about the melody made even their restless energy go still. The young woman at the piano didn't open her eyes. Her hair shifted gently in the breeze. Her fingers danced lightly over the black and white keys. There was no sheet music, no phone propped up to guide her. She played from somewhere deep inside. Each note carried something unspoken, something that felt like a secret. A small boy tugged on his mother's hand. "Who is she?" he whispered. The mother shook her head. "I don't know," she said softly, "but listen. It's beautiful." The melody swirled and dipped, sometimes light, like laughter. Sometimes slow, like the weight of a memory. It had no fixed shape. Yet it seemed to know exactly where it was going. It was the kind of sound that made a person stop thinking about where they were supposed to be and start remembering where they had been on the other side of the park. A man in a business suit put away his phone. He told himself he'd only stop for a moment. But the moment stretched into minutes as the music wrapped around him. He wasn't thinking about work anymore. He was thinking about the time his grandmother used to play the piano in her kitchen. He could almost smell the cookies baking. The girl had never met him, but somehow she had pulled a memory from the deepest part of him. A woman who had been jogging slowed to a walk. Her breathing matched the rhythm of the piano. She hadn't planned to stop. She hated stopping during a run, but her feet didn't care. They carried her closer until she was standing only a few feet away. She didn't speak, didn't move much. She just listened. The song shifted again. The notes fell into a gentle, almost aching pattern. Something in it carried both joy and sadness, like a goodbye that had been accepted but never fully understood. By now, the people in the park had changed. Some had left, but many more had gathered without meaning to. They stood or sat nearby, not forming a tight crowd, but connected by the same invisible thread. No one clapped, no one shouted, no one pulled out a speaker to compete with the sound. The world had quieted itself to make room for her. The girl still didn't open her eyes, her head tilted slightly, her lips parting as if she might hum along, but she didn't. The piano was enough. It was telling the story without words. And then, in one slow breath, she let the final chord linger. The sound hung in the air like it didn't want to leave. She kept her hands resting on the keys, her eyes still closed. And in that moment, it felt like the whole park was holding its breath. The strangers who stopped the music had a way of finding people, not just the ones sitting close by, but even those passing at the edge of the park. It was like the sound floated out and tapped them on the shoulder. inviting them without words. A delivery driver on his bike slowed to a crawl. He should have been hurrying to finish his shift, but something in the melody made him pause. He stopped near the fountain, pretending to check his phone. But his eyes kept drifting toward the piano, near a cluster of trees. A single father sat. With his young daughter, he had been trying to keep her entertained with a snack and a picture book. But now she was watching the girl at the piano. Her small legs swung over the edge of the bench. The father followed her gaze and listened. For the first time all week, the noise in his head began to fade. Not far away, an elderly man with a cane stood rooted to the spot. He had been walking slowly, just to stretch his legs, but the music made him forget the ache in his knees. He found himself leaning less on the cane. The sound reminded him of a dance hall from decades ago, of a night when he had held someone's hand and never wanted to let go. The group of teenagers from before had moved even closer. They weren't speaking, weren't laughing. One of them pulled out a phone, but not to film. He just wanted to hold on to the moment. Like taking a picture of the sky before the clouds moved. Across the park, a woman in her 20s stopped in mid-step. She had headphones on, music already playing in her ears. But her brain caught something, the sound of the piano slipping between the beats of her own song. She pulled off her headphones. And in seconds, the music she had been listening to all morning felt empty compared to this. A man in paint-stained overalls came by, carrying a heavy toolbox. He wasn't the type to stand around for street performers. He usually kept moving. But the notes caught him. He set the toolbox down and leaned against a bench. It felt like the kind of music you didn't walk away from, closer to the piano. The faces were different, but the expressions were the same, calm, thoughtful, a little lost in something they couldn't quite name. The music didn't just fill the air, it filled the space between them. Strangers were standing side by side, without even realizing it. A busker with a guitar over his shoulder stood at the edge of the gathering. He had been playing a few blocks away before following the sound. He listened, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like competing for attention. This wasn't about applause or coins in a case. This was something else entirely. The young woman at the piano seemed unaware of the quiet audience forming around her. Her head tilted slightly, her fingers moving with a rhythm that felt both precise and free. She wasn't playing for them. And maybe that's why it felt so pure. The music wasn't a performance. It was a conversation she was having with herself. A mother holding a sleeping baby walked by. The baby stirred at the sound, but instead of crying, it settled deeper into her arms. The mother stopped walking, swaying gently. The piano's melody wrapped around her like a blanket. For a moment, she forgot the grocery list in her bag. The bills at home, the long night ahead. The single father glanced around and noticed something strange. No one was talking loudly, no. One was rushing. It was as if the whole park had agreed without saying a word that this moment deserved stillness. The teenagers shifted. Unsure of how long they'd been standing there, one of them whispered, "It's like she's telling a story, but I don't know the words." The others nodded without looking away from the piano. The elderly man with the cane took a slow breath. In his mind, he was back in that dance hall, the smell of perfume and the warmth of a hand in his. He blinked hard, clearing his throat. It had been years since he'd remembered that night, and somehow, this girl had brought it back without even knowing him. The delivery driver finally sat down on the edge of the fountain. His bike leaned against the stone. The phone in his hand went dark as the screen timed out. Work could wait just for a few more minutes. The girl at the piano shifted the melody. The notes became lighter, almost playful. A breeze lifted a few strands of her hair. She tilted her head slightly, her fingers skipping like pebbles across water. A ripple went through. The small crowd smiles. Small and quiet, the single father smiled at his daughter. The teenagers exchanged glances that felt more like respect than amusement. The elderly man even tapped his cane softly in time with the music. For a brief stretch of time, the park wasn't a place of strangers anymore. It was a shared room without walls, circle around a piano where everyone, no matter how different their lives, was part of the same silence and sound. And still she played, as if the world beyond the keys didn't exist, as if this moment could last forever. The hidden story of the song kept flowing, but something about it had changed. It was still beautiful, still gentle, but there was a deeper pull in every note now. It's like she was speaking in a language only the piano understood. And somehow, everyone in the park was learning it. A little boy sitting cross-legged on the grass tilted his head. "Why does it sound sad?" he whispered to no one in particular. A woman nearby glanced at him and nodded. She didn't know the answer either. All she knew was that the music felt like the edge of a memory, one you couldn't quite touch but couldn't walk away from. The young woman's eyes stayed closed. Her fingers traced each chord as if they were pages from a book she had read 1,000 times. Her lips moved slightly, though no sound came out. Maybe she was counting the beats, or maybe she was mouthing words only she could hear. The busker with the guitar took a step closer. He had been listening quietly, but now his curiosity grew. He knew that kind of playing, the kind that didn't come from wanting to impress, but from needing to express. He'd seen it in street musicians who played after losing someone. He'd seen it in himself after long, lonely nights. A woman holding a paper coffee cup glanced at the piano and noticed something. The young woman's clothes were simple, a little worn. The sleeves of her sweater were frayed at the cuffs. The sneakers on her feet looked well-traveled. She didn't look like someone with a polished stage career. She looked like someone who carried her music wherever she went. From the other side of the piano, the single father noticed her hands. There was a faint mark on her left wrist, like an old scar. It wasn't obvious, but it caught his attention. She played with such tenderness that it was hard to imagine her having ever gone through anything painful. And yet, pain had a way of slipping into music no matter how much you tried to hide it. The melody shifted again. It rose and fell like someone taking a deep breath. A woman in a yellow scarf felt her eyes sting. She thought of her own mother, who had played piano in their small living room every Sunday. It had been years since she'd heard that sound in real life. The music in the park wasn't the same song, but it carried the same warmth, the same ache. A teenager in the group suddenly whispered, "She's not just playing random stuff. That's a real piece." But another shook his head. "No, it's not. I've never heard it before." They looked at each other, puzzled. If it was a known song, it had been reshaped into something completely her own. Near the back of the gathering, a man in a baseball cap stood with his arms crossed. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't leaving either. He had walked into the park on his way to somewhere else, but when he heard the music, it reminded him of a night in his younger years when he and a friend had stumbled into a small cafe where a woman played piano in the corner. That friend was gone now, but the memory felt alive again. It was strange how a stranger's music could bring back someone you'd lost. The girl's head tilted slightly forward, her shoulders relaxed, like she was sinking deeper into the song. She was far away, somewhere none of them could follow, and yet she was pulling them all with her. A mother with 2 kids stood near the edge of the crowd. Her youngest, no more than 4, tugged at her coat and asked, "Is she famous?" The mother smiled softly. "No, I don't think so." "Then why's everyone listening?" "Because the mother said, some things are worth stopping for." The elderly man with the cane leaned on it a little less now. He wasn't just remembering the dance hall anymore. He was remembering the girl he had danced with. Her laughter, her perfume, the way she had looked at him, as if they were the only 2 people in the room. He closed his eyes, letting the piano carry him. Back to that night when he opened them again, he realized his cheeks were wet. The busker shifted his guitar strap and took a deep breath. He recognized it now. This wasn't just skill. This was the sound of someone playing because they had to. Like the music was the only thing holding them together. A man sitting on the grass began to wonder if she had once played for someone she loved, someone who wasn't there anymore, the way she leaned into certain notes. Holding them just a moment longer than necessary, it felt like a pause for someone who couldn't answer. No one in the crowd knew her story, but in a way, they didn't need to. The mystery was part of what made the moment feel so rare. She had brought them all into her world without saying a single word. And maybe that was enough. The final notes of the piece flowed out like the last page of a letter. She let them fade. Her hands still resting lightly on the keys, her breathing slowed, but she didn't open her eyes. It was as if she wanted to stay in that place for just a little longer. Around her, no one moved. They were caught between wanting to applaud and not wanting to break the spell. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone buzzed, but no one looked at it. The moment was too fragile to risk losing. The young woman finally lifted her hands from the piano. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the sight of the people gathered. She blinked, almost startled by how many there were. But instead of speaking, she simply placed her hands in her lap and looked down. It was clear she hadn't come here to BCN. She had come here to play, and in doing so, she had given everyone more than they expected. The emotional shift, the young woman began to play again, but this time, the music was different. The first notes came slow and soft, almost like a whisper. It was the kind of sound that didn't rush, it waited. It let the air around it breathe. The crowd leaned in without realizing it. Something in the way she touched the keys felt personal. As if she was opening a door into a place most people kept locked. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it carried weight. Every note seemed to have something to say. The single father sitting with his daughter felt it first. He hadn't planned to stay this long. He had things to do. But as the melody unfolded, his chest tightened. It reminded him of nights long ago when his wife would hum to their baby in the dark. She had been gone for almost 3 years now. He thought the memories had settled, but now the music pulled them forward like it had been saving them for this moment. He reached for his daughter's hand. She looked up at him, surprised. "Are you okay?" she whispered. He nodded, but his voice didn't work, so he just squeezed her hand. Letting the music speak for him, a few steps away, the elderly man with the cane closed his eyes again. The song had shifted into something tender. It was no longer about the excitement of youth. It was about the kind of love that stays after everything else fades. He pictured his wife's smile, could almost hear her saying his name. For the first time in years, it didn't hurt as much to remember. The group of teenagers had gone unusually quiet. One of them, who usually cracked jokes at every chance, stood with his hands in his pockets. He felt strange, not in a bad way, but in a way that made him notice things. The breeze on his face, the sound of leaves moving overhead. He realized he'd been holding his breath. Near the fountain, the delivery driver still sat with his phone in his hand. The song reached a point where the notes rose higher, and for some reason, his eyes stung. He thought about his mother, how she used to play an old, broken keyboard when he was little. She would smile even when life was hard. He had forgotten that sound until now. It made him want to call her, just to hear her voice. The woman in the yellow scarf dabbed at her eyes. She had told herself she wasn't the crying type, but this wasn't the kind of sadness that hurt. It was the kind that reminded you of everything you'd once loved, and how lucky you had been to have it at all. The young woman at the piano still didn't look at the crowd. Her head was bowed, her hair falling forward, her fingers moved with care, as if she didn't want to hurt the keys. She wasn't just playing music. She was telling the kind of story that only the heart understood. The busker with the guitar listened more intently now. He knew she wasn't just improvising. She was weaving emotions into the notes. It was something only real musicians could do, and she was doing it without a single sign of hesitation. A soft breeze swept through the park. The leaves rustled in time with the rhythm. A pigeon landed nearby, tilting its head toward the sound. Even the everyday noise of the city seemed to quiet down, as if the world itself wanted to listen. The single father glanced around and realized something. No one in the crowd was looking at their phones anymore. No one was checking the time. Everyone was here. Completely here. And he wondered when he'd last seen that happen in this city. The teenagers began shifting their weight, not because they were bored, but because the song was making them think in ways they weren't used to. One thought about his grandmother. Another thought about an old friend he hadn't spoken to in months, without saying a word. They all knew this moment would stick with them. The elderly man tapped his cane in slow time with the beat, but his mind was elsewhere. He was replaying his wedding day. The music wasn't the same as the one they had danced to, but the feeling, it was identical. The song began to climb. The notes grew stronger, fuller. It was as if the girl was leading everyone up a hill, not to tire them, but to show them something on the other side. When the high notes rang out, the delivery driver drew in a sharp breath. It hit him all at once, how much he had been rushing through life, how he'd been treating every day as something to survive. But this moment felt different. It made him think there might be more to notice if he just slowed down, and then, as gently as it had risen, The song began to fall, the notes softened. Like someone whispering good night, her hands lingered on the last chord, letting it breathe, letting it stay in the air. As long as it wanted, the crowd didn't move. Some closed their eyes, some kept watching her fingers. But all of them felt it, that quiet shift deep inside. It wasn't the kind of change you could measure. It was the kind you carried without knowing until later. The young woman finally let the sound fade. She straightened slightly, but still didn't speak. The park was silent for a beat longer. And then, without a word, she began another song, and the spell deepened. The personal confessions, the song shifted again this time. It carried a warmth that felt like sunlight after a long winter. It wasn't loud or quick, didn't need to be. It simply wrapped itself around the people listening, making them feel as though they were safe here, even if just for a while. The single father felt his shoulders loosen. For the first time in months, the constant weight pressing down on him felt lighter. He looked at his daughter and smiled. She smiled back, though she didn't know why. It wasn't about the words, it was about the feeling, and that was enough. A woman in the yellow scarf took a step closer to the stranger beside her. She had never spoken to him before, but the song made her want to say something. "I used to play," she whispered, almost as if confessing. The man turned, his eyes warm. "Why'd you stop?" Her gaze dropped. "Life. Just got busy, I guess," she said. But even as she spoke, she knew that wasn't the full truth. She had stopped when her mother passed away. The piano had felt too heavy without her in the room. A young man in the group of teenagers leaned toward his friend. "You ever feel like music? I don't know, knows you?" His friend grinned faintly. "Yeah. Like it's talking to you without talking to you." They didn't laugh after saying it. They just stood there, hearing the unspoken truth in each other's words. The elderly man with the cane shifted his weight. He glanced at the woman standing. Beside him, a stranger in a gray coat. "My wife used to love songs like this," murmured. The woman smiled softly. She must have had good taste. He chuckled under his breath. She did. Then his eyes went back to the piano. "She's been gone a long time. But right now, it feels like she's here." The woman didn't reply. She just placed her hand lightly on his arm. It was enough, near the fountain. The delivery driver set his phone on the stone edge and turned to the man next to him. He said quietly, "I was going to rush home today." But this, he gestured toward the piano. "This made me remember my mom." The man nodded slowly. "I called my son just now," he admitted. "I haven't talked to him in weeks." They shared a faint smile, both surprised by how easily they were speaking to each other. They had met only minutes ago, but somehow the music made it feel like they had known each other far longer. The busker with the guitar adjusted the strap over his shoulder. He leaned toward a woman holding a sleeping baby. "She's good," he whispered. The woman smiled. "She's more than good," he nodded. "Yeah. I've played for years, but I don't think I've ever played like that." The woman glanced at him. Maybe because she's not trying to play for anyone, just for herself. He thought about that for a moment and realized she was right, eh? Man in paint-stained overalls, who had been silent since he stopped walking, finally spoke up to no one in particular. "This is the first time I've stood still all day." A few people near him smiled faintly. He shrugged. "I fix things for a living, but this feels like it's fixing me." The young woman at the piano still hadn't looked at them. Her eyes stayed closed, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. It was as if she was hearing the same things they were: memories, voices, feelings, but she was speaking them in notes instead of words. The woman in the yellow scarf found herself saying something she hadn't admitted to anyone in years. "When my mom died, I couldn't touch a piano," she whispered to the man beside her, "but listening to her makes me want to try again." The man didn't say much, just nodded and said, "Then you should." The single father, still holding his daughter's hand, leaned closer to her. "You know your mom used to play?" he said. Softly, the little girl's eyes widened. "She did." He nodded. "Yeah. Maybe one day I'll show you for the first time in a long time." The thought didn't hurt. The delivery driver picked up his phone and turned it over in his hands. "I'm calling her," he muttered to himself, and he did right there in the park. When his mother answered, his voice softened. "I just wanted to hear you," he said. She laughed on the other end, asking what had gotten into him. He didn't try to explain. The busker was still listening. He knew he'd remember this day whenever he picked up his guitar. Not because of the crowd, but because of how she played without needing one. The song slowed again, drifting toward its end. Her hands rested on the keys a moment longer than necessary, and when she lifted them, there was a pause, not awkward, but full, as if no one wanted to break what had just been shared. Someone near the front whispered, "Thank you." The girl didn't react, but maybe she had heard. A few people exchanged glances, their faces softer than before. Some had tears in their eyes, some had small smiles, but all of them knew they had been part of something rare, and just like that, without asking for applause or attention. She began another song, and the park leaned in again, ready to feel whatever came next. The ending note, the next song began slowly. The notes were delicate, almost hesitant. It was as if the young woman was choosing each one carefully, not because she didn't know what to play, but because she wanted to make sure every note had a reason to be there. The crowd had grown quiet again, not just in their voices, but in their movements. Even the restless ones, the teenagers, the joggers, who had stopped, people who had originally planned to stay only for a minute, were still. The park seemed to be holding its breath. A single ray of late afternoon sunlight slipped through the clouds. It landed on the piano keys, making them gleam faintly. Her fingers moved across them like she was painting with sound. The melody felt softer than before, not sad, not exactly happy, just peaceful, the kind of peace that comes after a long storm. The single father leaned back on the bench, still holding his daughter's hand. She was swaying gently to the rhythm now, her eyes half closed. It was rare to see her so calm, and he wanted to remember it, not just the sight of her, but the way this moment felt, like they were both hearing something they needed. Even if they couldn't say what it was, the elderly man with the cane stood without leaning on it. He didn't even realize it at first. The music had carried him somewhere else again. Back to a quiet evening decades ago. The memory was faint, but it was warm. And he let it stay a little longer. The woman in the yellow scarf had stopped thinking about her errands for the day. She wasn't worried about the clock. Her mind was. Somewhere between her past and her present, she felt a strange kind of gratitude for being here at this exact place. At this exact time, if she had taken a different route home, she would have missed it. And the thought made her shiver. The busker with the guitar knew what was happening. This was her final song. He could tell by the way she was playing. Each note lingered just a little longer. It was the way a good musician said goodbye without speaking. The melody began to shift. It climbed slowly, reaching higher notes like it was trying to touch something just out of reach. The delivery driver felt his chest tighten again, not with sadness this time, but with the kind of emotion that made. You want to take better care of your life? He thought about all the days he had rushed through without noticing anything. Today wasn't one of those days. A little boy in the front sat cross-legged, his chin resting on his hands. He didn't understand why this moment felt so important, but he could feel it anyway. He would remember this, maybe not the details, but the way it made him feel. The young woman leaned into the last section of the song. Her fingers moved a little slower, the notes spaced out. Each one standing alone before the next arrived. It felt like she was giving everyone time to take them in, to keep them. Some people in the crowd had their eyes closed. Some were watching her hands as if trying to memorize the way they moved. A teenager in the back was recording now, but even he wasn't holding his phone high. It was just for himself, something to listen to later, when the park was quiet and she was gone. The final notes arrived like the end of a sentence you didn't want to finish. She let the last one ring out. It hung in the air, trembling slightly, then it faded. Her hands stayed on the keys for a moment longer, her head lowered, her shoulders. Still, no one moved. And then she lifted her hands and stood. It was so quiet that her footsteps on the pavement sounded loud. She didn't bow, didn't wave. She simply closed the piano lid gently, as if tucking something in for the night. The crowd seemed unsure what to do. Some people whispered, some smiled at strangers they'd never met before, but no one called after her. It felt wrong to interrupt whatever world she was returning to. The single father watched her walk away. He wanted to say thank you, but the words felt too small. Instead, he held his daughter close. The elderly man with the cane followed her with his eyes until she turned the corner and was gone. The woman in the yellow scarf exhaled slowly, as if she'd been holding the breath through the whole song. The busker with the guitar finally sat down. He didn't play. He just looked at the empty piano and shook his head. That, he murmured to himself, was something else. The delivery driver picked up his bike, but before leaving, he stood there a little longer. He wanted to carry this feeling with him, even if the sound itself had already faded. The little boy still sat cross-legged, staring at the piano. Finally, his mother touched his shoulder. "Come on," she said softly. He nodded, but kept looking back as they walked away. The park slowly began to return to its usual rhythm. Children running, dogs barking, joggers passing. But for those who had been there, it didn't feel quite the same. Something had shifted. They had all heard something they couldn't explain. And it was going to stay with them. The aftermath. The piano sat alone now. The chipped paint caught the fading light of the afternoon. The lid was closed, the keys hidden. But the air still seemed to hum with the memory of her music. People began to drift away. Some walked slowly, as if leaving too quickly might erase what had just happened. Others lingered, pretending to check their phones or tie their shoes, but really, they were just holding on to the feeling a little longer. The single father walked toward the park's exit with his daughter. She skipped beside him, humming a tune she had pieced together from the music. It wasn't exactly the same, but it carried the same gentle rise and fall. He listened to her for a moment before saying, "You've got a good ear." She grinned up at him. "Can we get a piano?" He laughed softly. "We'll see," but inside, he was already thinking about it seriously. The elderly man with the cane took the long route home. Usually his steps were slow because of the pain. Today they were slow because he wanted to. Every corner he turned seemed to bring back another memory of his wife. Not in the sharp, painful way it used to, but in a way that made him feel close to her, as if she had walked with him out of the park. The woman in the yellow scarf stopped at a small cafe before heading home. She ordered tea and found herself sitting by the window. Her mind was still in the park. The sound of the music kept looping in her head. She pulled out her phone and searched for piano lessons in the area. She hadn't touched a keyboard in years, but suddenly, she couldn't imagine another year passing without one. The delivery driver hopped on his bike and began pedaling. But instead of heading straight to his last delivery, he took a detour. He passed his old neighborhood, slowed down in front of the small apartment building where he had grown up. The window to his mother's old living room was open. He could almost imagine her inside, tapping a tune on her worn-out keyboard. He smiled to himself before continuing on. Later that night, he would call her again, this time to tell her he was coming to visit. The busker with the guitar found a bench on another street corner. He set his guitar on his lap and began to play. Not for tips, not for attention. Just to see if he could play the way she had. Not for anyone else, but for himself. The notes didn't come out the same, but there was something new in the way his fingers moved. Something he knew had been planted back in that park a little. Boy, who had sat cross-legged during the performance, went home and told his mother. She wasn't famous, but she should be. His mother laughed. "Why do you say that?" "Because she made everybody quiet," he said matter-of-factly that night, as she tucked him in. He hummed the melody again. It wasn't perfect, but it was his way of keeping it alive. The group of teenagers walked toward the bus stop. At first they were quiet, then one of them said, "We should hang out at the park more." Another smirked, "Just so you can hear more piano." But no one teased him further, because they all felt it too. That moment had been different, and in some unspoken way, it had connected them more than their usual loud jokes ever did. In the cafe, the woman in the yellow scarf tapped her fingers on the table in the shape of piano keys. She didn't notice she was doing it until the server smiled and asked if she played. "Not yet," she replied with a small smile. "But I will." In his apartment, the single father sat at the kitchen table after putting his daughter to bed. He opened his laptop and searched for small pianos and keyboards. He imagined teaching her the basics. He imagined her sitting at a real piano one day, playing just like the girl in the park. It was a thought that made him feel both hopeful and grounded. The elderly man sat in his living room, a cup of tea in hand. On the table beside him was an old photo album. He flipped through the pages slowly. He stopped on a picture of him and his wife dancing. His fingers rested on the image. The music from the park seemed to play faintly in the back of his mind. He smiled and whispered, "I heard you today." Across the city, the busker was still. Playing on his corner, a few people stopped to listen. And while it wasn't the same magic as in the park, there was a new sincerity in his playing that made people pause. Some even stayed longer than they meant to, just like he had, the piano. In the park remained silent, its lid closed, its keys waiting. But the sound of that afternoon still lived in conversations, in quiet moments, in small choices people made without fully knowing why. They didn't know if the girl would ever return. They didn't know her name, but each of them carried a piece of her music into their own lives, and in that way, she hadn't really left.